Don't settle for bad socks. Get comfort and grip at an affordable price with Pure Grip Socks Pro. Choose from 18 different colors at puregripsocks.com.
Who makes the better sub $100 speed boot? Nike or Adidas? Where for $90 you can get yourself a pair of Adidas F50 Leagues, what is technically the second takedown model in the F50 lineup. However, from Nike, also as the second tier takedown model in the Mercurial Vapor lineup, you can get yourself a pair of Vapor 16 Academies for just $85. Both of which, by the way, you can actually pick up for even less than that by way of some exclusive SR4U coupon codes if you check out the links down below. Although it must be said that these technically aren't the only second tier takedown model options in the speed boot category from either Nike or Adidas. I'd argue that these are the best, but technically from Nike, if you'd prefer something mid-cut, you can get the Superfly 10 Academy at $95, and from Adidas, there is technically a women's mid-cut version of the F50 League, also for a $90 retail price, and even a laceless variant at $100 if that's your thing. And really quickly, before we keep going, if you guys enjoy these comparison videos, perhaps want to see more takedown models compared on the channel, don't forget to drop a like on this one and make sure you're subscribed if you haven't already so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots of 2024. When it comes to uppers, both offer a fantastic feel for what they cost, with the furthest departure from the top-end Elite model definitely being what you get from the Academy tier Mercurials, where you basically have a Nike skin mesh-based synthetic, which is somewhat sock-like, like you'd get from the Grip Knit, Atom Knit, and Fly Knit construction of the $260 variant. However, you're not going to get any grip on the surface. It's been left relatively smooth. From a feel perspective, the boots are definitely thin, but they have that little bit of softness and plushness from the mesh base itself, which isn't paper thin like you'd find from some other speed boots on the market. It mimics the construction of the high-end model where the material gets a little bit thinner through the midfoot, which truthfully you don't really feel. And honestly, from a touch perspective, I think what you get from this boot at $85 is really impressive and nothing that feels cheap in any way whatsoever. Where the upper of the F50 League is visually much more similar to that of the top-end Elite model at $260, and in terms of overall feel, probably a little bit closer than the Mercurials as well. Instead of fiber touch, you're getting what they call fiber skin, which is still a textile-based material, maybe a little bit more plasticky in terms of its overall feel, and you get what they call sprint grid rather than sprint web, which instead of a micro texturing, you have this ribbed finish, basically running the length of the football boot that admittedly doesn't provide the same grip on the ball as the higher end variations. From a feel perspective, it's definitely less padded and overall more raw than what you're going to get from the Merc. So if you prefer more of a true barefoot experience, you get a little bit less padding on the F50s than what you get from the Vapor 16 Academy. But I would also argue that because it's a little bit more plasticky, it's not quite as comfortable against your foot. So at the end of the day, it's a bit of a trade-off here. If you prefer something that's on the thinner side with no padding, definitely go for the F50 League, where if you want something that's thin, that still has that little bit of plushness to it, you might prefer the Nike skin of the Mercurials. When it comes to sole plates and stud patterns, this is where you're going to find a much bigger difference between these two, and in my eyes, a pretty clear winner in terms of what offers the more premium speed boot experience. With the Sprint Plate 360 sole plate of the F50 League being pretty straightforward in terms of its overall construction, it's flexible in all the right places, and generally just feels like a normal football boot sole plate. There really isn't any other way to put it, and as far as the stud pattern is concerned, this is the standard F50 FG stud pattern, exactly like what you would find on the top end model, which does provide good traction, but is it as aggressive as what you'll find from some other speed boots? Definitely not. It by no means feels cheap and performs exceptionally well considering the $90 price tag of the boots, but it certainly isn't a standout. Where the Mercs feature a sole plate and stud pattern that I just think feels much more speed focused in terms of just being a little bit more responsive in terms of how it flexes through the forefoot. The design of the sole plate is obviously going to mimic that of the top end model. However, instead of the normal FG stud pattern, the Academy tier Mercurials are only available in what they call an FG-MG layout, MG standing for multi-ground, where you'll notice that some of the bladed studs have been swapped out for conical ones, predominantly these two in the forefoot and these two at the back of the heel. In other words, you get a little bit more freedom to twist and pivot, making this technically better suited for use on artificial grass than the normal high-end FG stud pattern would provide. Granted, they're not as aggressive because of that design element, but even so, when compared to the stud pattern on offer from the F50 League, this is going to provide way more bite in pretty much every direction, and because of the general feel and shaping of the sole plate, the boots as a whole just offer way more aggressive traction. If you're looking for a pair of speed boots that generally feel like they put you on your toes at all times, these do a significantly better job of that than the F50. While I wouldn't say it's a meaningful feature, it is still worth mentioning because you'll notice plastered across the heel of the Mercurials is the word air, and that's because if you look underneath the insole, there is a 6-sided air zoom unit sitting directly underneath your heel, which is mimicking the technology of what you'd find on the top-end Elite model. However, instead of spanning the entire forefoot, it's underneath the heel and so small that unless you're standing on a hard surface and kind of squishing your heel into the ground, you really don't feel it at all. Where the F50, in comparison, when it comes to cushion tech, really doesn't feature anything other than a standard foam insole that I would also argue isn't quite as premium as what you'd find from the Nikes. Again, I don't really think that this is a meaningful element on the Mercurial, but for those that are into their modern football boot tech, it is worth mentioning that you do get that unique feature with the Mercs that you don't get with the F50s. Of course, being that these are both speed boots, even though they are technically the budget-friendly models, the expectation I would think from most people is that they're going to be pretty light. But what exactly is the weight difference between the two? Both in the same size 9.5 US. We'll start off with the F50s, and you can see that they weigh in at 8.95 ounces, the equivalent of 254 grams. Remember those numbers, change the scale back to ounces, and we'll throw on the Mercurials, and you can see that they weigh in at 8.05 ounces, the equivalent of 228 grams, which is a weight difference of almost a full ounce or just over 25 grams in favor of the Mercurial Vapor 16 Academy, which admittedly, both in hand as well as on feet, does feel like the lighter of these two speed boots. Not that you need lightweight boots to be fast, but certainly if you're after that lightweight feel, you get a much better sensation of that from the Mercs than you do the F50s. When it comes to fit and overall comfort, I think both are really solid options. The main difference is the way that they fit, where I think the Mercurials definitely feel a lot like the higher end model in terms of having a little bit of a slimmer profile all the way through that kind of contours and wraps your foot in a way that feels a little bit more tight and squeezy, if that makes any sense, which I think really makes the boots feel super secure, super responsive, and just honestly very connected to your foot. They have that one-to-one instantaneous reaction time where paired up with the lighter overall construction that this boot has compared to the F50 does make them feel more like a high-end pair of speed boots, where the F50s definitely fit very comfortably, but they have a much wider base overall, despite not really being that much wider in terms of overall shape. If anything, I'd actually argue that the F50s are a little bit lower in terms of volume, but definitely have more width to them through the forefoot and midfoot that do make them feel very comfortable, but definitely a little bit less speed focused than what the Mercurial has on offer. From a width perspective, I think that the F50s have that little bit of extra width, but both of these boots will work well for most foot types. As long as you don't have excessively wide feet, you shouldn't have any issues with either of them. And as far as sizing is concerned, I'm wearing both of these boots in my usual size 9.5 US. So regardless of which one you plan on going for, true to size is what I would strongly recommend. The main difference that you have to take into consideration here is, do you want something that has that tighter wrap around your foot feel? If so, the Mercs are going to be the much better option. Whereas if you want something that arguably has a little bit more of a forgiving fit and feel while still fitting very well, I definitely think the F50 League would be the better option for you. So in conclusion, while I think both of these are really solid football boots overall, when you're talking about which one is the better speed boot, I definitely think that's the Vapor. Not only is it technically $5 less expensive, I think the fit and feel is much more speed boot-like in terms of wrapping your foot a little bit more tightly, having that more responsive feel. The sole plate as a whole is shaped in such a way that really feels like it puts you on your toes. They're lighter overall, and the traction is much more aggressive than what the F50 has on offer. So realistically, if you're looking for a pair of budget-friendly speed boots that feel the most like a high-end pair of speed boots, it would definitely be the Vapor 16 Academy. With that said, I do think the F50 League does mimic in a lot of ways what that top-end F50 Elite has on offer in terms of just being a little bit more of a simple, no-nonsense speed boot type in terms of fitting, a little bit more forgiving, having some extra width to it, the central lacing system, and just the way the tongue in general works just feels like the boots don't squeeze your foot quite as tightly, which from a comfort perspective might just be your cup of tea. And while I don't think there's much of an excuse for the extra weight and the feel of the sole plate maybe not being quite as aggressive as it perhaps should be, all the performance characteristics of the F50 League are still really, really solid and well above average for what you would expect to get from a boot retailing for just $90. Which one would you pick?